Good afternoon. Welcome to the second in our LIR series on issues related to artificial intelligence. Last week, we heard about using medical data to make ER treatment of patients presenting with possible heart attack symptoms more rational and effective. On December 5th, Stuart Russell, the leading campus expert on the whole field of AI, will offer his broad overview and perspectives. Today, we will hear another example of the application of AI technologies to a scholarly problem, in this case in connection with language. Our speaker today is Gasper Begush, an assistant professor in the Department of Linguistics since 2020. He did undergraduate work at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia, receiving diplomas in both comparative linguistics and Slovene language and literature. He did his graduate work in linguistics at Harvard, where he received his PhD in 2018. And after teaching at the University of Washington for 2 years, he came to Berkeley, where he is now the director of the Berkeley Speech and Computation Lab and is affiliated with the Institute of Cognitive and Brain Sciences. He currently also serves as the college principal of Bowles Hall Residential College. Professor Begush is an expert in phonology and also in computational methods applied to phonology and other aspects of language. As he describes it, he builds models that learn representations of spoken words from raw audio inputs. He combines machine learning and statistical models with neuroimaging and behavioral experiments to better understand how neural networks learn internal representations in speech and how humans learn to speak. It is from this fascinating area of research that he draws today's topic, understanding generative AI and language, humans, animals, and machines. Welcome, Professor Begush.
Thank you so much. And it's a great pleasure to be part of this program and this series. Thanks, everyone, for joining in. I just want to say I'm giving the talk from Bowles Hall, which is the only residential college at UC Berkeley, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with it and its rich tradition. And we're happy to be celebrating over 90 years as well here at Bowles. But anyway, so today, and thanks for mentioning that my role, it's a special role here at Berkeley that I serve in. But today I want to talk about a different topic, which is AI interpretability. All of the papers and code and materials, including some media coverage, is available on the QR code on the bottom right corner. The idea is that we're in the age of AI, and it's getting, the models that we've been building are performing really well. We have GPT-4, we have all sorts of models nowadays that are performing extremely well. I think now is the time to try to understand these models and to try to understand what they're doing and how they're learning. So AI interpretability is basically the new frontier in AI research. As I mentioned, now the performance is really good. I think we need to look inside how these networks are learning. And that has been termed, the black box. One of the difficult problems in machine learning is to try to understand how these models are learning, what they're doing. There's this idea that we don't know what they're doing. It's a black box. It's all opaque. And I think that's not necessarily all true. I think there's a way to introspect these models, try to understand. And by doing that, I think we're going to be getting, a whole new level of insights in the years to come. So in my lab, what we've been working on is to kind of marry two areas. One is language and everything we know about language, and we know that language is very important for humans. It's one of the things that we have, and that in this exact same shape and form animals do not have, and other intelligence do not have. And on the other hand, machine learning. So how can we use the knowledge of language to understand AI, and vice versa, how we can use AI to understand language and our intelligence. And I'm going to show you in a second, I'm going to bring animals into the picture because they are very interesting creatures and they have biological neuroprocessing, right? So now we have three players, the animals, humans, and machines, that my lab is looking into at great detail. So I'm going to talk about several techniques for introspecting AI, basically, for trying to understand how AI is learning. And we're going to talk about behavior interpretability and internal interpretability. But the main idea is that now that performance of the AI models, of deep learning models, is so good, we need to interpret it. We need to understand it, how it works. And by doing that, we're going to learn a lot. So it is important to, why is this important? It's important because understanding AI means that we start to understand how we humans learn and how we diverge from artificial intelligence, right? So the models are becoming really good. Like, you can have a large language model now that can generate text, answer questions for you. Stuff that was not possible even a couple of years ago, but they're not learning in the same ways as humans are learning in every respect, right? So understanding how we're similar and different is going to be very important. And understanding AI means that we can use AI to our advantage, in a more tangible way that I'm going to talk about throughout this talk. So as I mentioned, I'm going to bring animals into the picture because there's been two debates in two separate fields, pretty much, but they're very related. Okay, so one debate is, and we've heard about a lot about it from media and from recent developments in science, which is like, can we ever get the artificial general intelligence, right? Can we build models that are as smart as humans? Okay, or in other words, we have artificial intelligence and we have humans. Is everything that we have, are these models that are biologically inspired, that are basically, built to approximate our neurons, can they ever be as smart as we are? Or is there something that we're missing? Is there some part of architecture, part of, deep learning that we still need to figure out for it to be possible to get to the human level, right? And in a separate field, in kind of comparative animal studies, there's been long-standing debate about language in animals and their intelligence. And we know that humans have language, and in exact same shape and form, animals do not. But they have many traits of language, right? So the question is, are humans just smarter animals, and language, evolved because the brain power or computation power just increased to the degree that language is possible? Or is there something, uniquely human, that, some sort of genetic mutation, some sort of rewiring of the brain that needed to happen for language to evolve, right? So these are two debates, that basically two sides of the same medal. And I think it's important to acknowledge that what we're actually asking here is very similar, right? So and that we have three players now. We have the animals, we have the humans, and we have the machines. And this is how I'm going to frame today's discussion. And I'm going to show you that if we study all these three intelligences, so artificial ones and two biological ones, human and non-human, we can learn a lot about each other. And so it's this kind of bidirectional, learning. We can learn about AI if we study it from humans' perspective. We can learn about humans and our language and our development if you study it with AI. So these are the two related questions that I'm going to frame my discussion around. And one thing that interpretability of AI can give us is that we can understand what these well-performing networks are learning. And that is huge. Why it is huge? Because artificial intelligence is artificial. It's not human, which means it's not human biased, right? We've heard a lot about social biases. Of course, AI is biased because it's trained on human data, but as models, they are less biased than humans are. And so we can leverage that. We can use their artificialness, the fact that they're not human, train these networks on various tasks, and then look inside them and ask them, okay, what did you learn? What did you figure out about this data that I as human cannot? And I'm gonna show you today how we do that on whale communication systems. So we're trying to understand what sperm whales are saying to each other. They have an extremely interesting communication system, but we do not, we do not know what anything of means. So we can use that. We can use our AI interpretability techniques to try to get to an understanding of what it can be meaningful there. And also we can use, I'm going to show you, we can use AI techniques to these interpretability techniques to understand human neural processing and run experiments that are ethically impossible in real biological intelligence. Okay, so one thing that one reason that I think that interpretability of AI has not been a huge field is because most of the work in AI has been done on vision, right? So visual language, visual word is very complex, but machine learning always starts with vision, and so it is. Speech is great for trying to understand deep neural networks, AI, because it is, in a sense, still a continuous data, but it is very simple. We have only a few phonemes, we have only a few words, I mean, 5,000 words altogether. Languages have about, tens of phonemes, about 40 phonemes in English, for example. And that's much simpler system than visual world, okay? And so speech is great for doing this kind of interpretability, but machine learning always is focused on vision. Vision is very complex, right? If it just think of the number of colors, number of shapes that we distinguish from, it's much more complex than spoken language. And for interpretability, simple is what you want, because these models are very complex. And if you test some complex entity on a complex data, then getting understandings about these models is difficult. But if you test, if you start simpler, the tasks are easier. So I think part of the reason why these models have been turned into black boxes is because vision is so complex. And this is my case to make that we should work on speech because it's a great testing ground for understanding language. And if you think of like, what does artificial intelligence do? It takes some continuous space, right? It takes some physical space and represent it with representational units, right? Deep learning used to be called representation learning, or like AI can be called representation learning, because you take some continuous space and you represent it with discrete units. And this is exactly what humans do when we hear spoken language, right? Spoken language is the only measurable continuous property of language, right? And we take it, humans, and represent it with mental representational units that carry meaning, like words or phonemes, right? So words and phonemes are discrete, and it's essentially the same, the first step and the same thing that we and artificial intelligence need to do in order to get to mental representational unit space and this abstract space, the representational space, right? So, and finally, language has been studying for like centuries, if not millennia, and we know some things about language. Maybe we know more about language and acquisition than we know about human vision. And the last thing, AI is now all about generative AI, right? So when we generate, when AI produces sequences or tokens or whatever, pictures. And so if you think of spoken language, humans have innate generator, right? So we have mouth with which we speak, we have articulators with which we speak, and we can always, generate new words, new sounds, new sentences. But for vision, we do not have the generator. We do not have a giant screen where my thoughts are translated into visual outputs. I can ask you to imagine a red apple, and you can imagine a red apple, but it's very difficult for me to access your imagination. So in vision, we basically only have the input and no output. And if you study generative AI, which generates data, it's great to have a system like speech that also has the generative principle. Okay, so the first thing we need to do before we get there to this kind of better understanding of human language and AI is to create more realistic models of human language acquisition, okay? So we talk about LLMs these days a lot, which are great. They are wonderful. They produce amazing text. But that's not how humans learn language. The way they're trained looks nothing like how humans learn, right? So no baby learns from text. No baby learns from so much text as LLMs are trained on. No baby learns without listening and hearing, right? We learn from raw audio, and no baby learns without communicative intent. So the way LLMs are trained, large language models are trained, is like on massive amounts of text, and they're trained by producing the next token. And so what we've been doing in our lab is we've been building models with deep learning, but models of human language that learn more like humans do, okay? And this is a representation of how our language works for hearing, language learners. We have some information in the brain. We encode it into our muscles that are moving, which gets translated into sound by a physical property of sound propagation. And that travels into your ears, a listener's ears, and gets decoded through the brain into the message again, right? And importantly, we have the feedback loop as well. So we hear our own speech as well. So what we've been working on is this model that we call the Sequin, that basically is what we think the closest approximation of human speech act with deep learning. Okay, so what happens is we have a generative adversarial network, which is basically an architecture where you have the generator on the left, which is a model that takes some random noise and transforms it into data. But in our case, that data is not sounds yet. It's actually representations of our tongue and lips and, in short, articulators. So we're building models that learn to move articulators, and then that gets transformed into sound by a pre-trained model, which just takes articulators and transforms them into sound. And there's nothing cognitive about that. So this is a pre-trained physical model that we are agnostic about. And so that spoken output, the output of the model which is trained on moving articulators, gets sent to two networks. One network is the discriminator on the right left at the bottom. The discriminator is a network that needs to distinguish between real and fake data. Okay, so this whole learning is a gameplay between a generator that generates data and the discriminator that figures what is generated data, what is the generator's output. So in other words, fake, and what is real data. Okay, so the network that produces speech needs to learn how to imitate spoken language, so how to approximate what another network hears from adults, basically. Okay, so it's a game of imitation and imagination. It's like learning by imagitation, as I call it, because the network that generates data never actually sees data. It just gets a feedback about how real its output sounds. So if you think of a child, it hears output from adults, and it needs to learn to move articulators so that its output will resemble the input that it hears, that the child hears from parents. Now, there's another component to this, which is the outputs also get sent to a Q network, which basically, that's the upper right hand of the screen. You see the Q network, and that green network needs to decode information. Okay, So it's like learning by imitation, imagination, and learning to embed information. So these are the components that our model includes, and I think that this is what it makes it more realistic than competitive model. So in other words, the generator needs to learn to produce speech so that it looks like speech, and also so that it contains information. Okay, and this is what humans need to do as well. Now that makes it advantageous to other models, as I mentioned. So our model is completely fully unsupervised. All it gets is no labels, no specific instructions, just raw audio, right? It just is part of a raw audio. Second, it contains the production perception loop. Okay, so it produces and it basically it speaks and hears, and that's how it learns, and that's the necessary component for kids as well. It has embodiment, right? It learns to speak with mouth by moving mouth. It has communicative intent because it needs to embed information, and the Q network and the generator network needs to. So the way it happens is we have a unique code that the generator transforms into speech, and then that spoken output gets transformed back to the code by the Q network. So we have that communicative intent. And what we observe that many aspects of human language emerge in such a network, okay? And this is the body of work that we've been working on a lot. And so now we're building a model that learns like, more like human babies, like we're building this artificial baby language learner. Now we need to get to what it learns. And we observe, as I mentioned here on the bottom, that like symbolic-like disentangled linguistic-like representation emerge in these models. Okay, so one of the interpretability technique that we're using is actually very simple, and it is very powerful to give us ideas about what the network had learned. Okay, so as I mentioned at the beginning, in this architecture, the model that generates data, that produces speech, takes on the left hand, takes some, under the latent space title, takes some random noise as input, okay? And then it's trained to generate speech from that. Now, one simple interpretability technique where you can get to, underlying representations of what the models had learned is to take that random space, and during the training, that random space is limited, like the blue variables, to some values for example, from -1 to 1. Now, if we want to understand what each neuron, what each unit had learned about data, we just take a single unit and stretch it to extreme values. We call this extreme values disentanglement, which gives us a really powerful tool to understand what each unit in a network is doing. Okay, and this is how we learn that the network, completely on its own, learns representations of sounds, like presentations of S. And not only that, we can causally manipulate those representations. That single unit here in red, for example, if you stretch it to extreme values, it'll tell you what this single unit is encoding. And then as you're and we learned that a single unit, for example, is representing an S. And if you're manipulating that unit, I can take S in and out from the output. Okay, I can actively manipulate something that is meaningful in language, which is S. We all know that S is meaningful. We know that a word for pit has a different meaning than spit. And so I can, by only manipulating a single unit, I can take this S and make it disappear. Okay, and I never tell the network, learn S. I never told the network anything other than learn to imitate spoken language. and then embed information into speech. Here we have words. It learns, the model learns words. It learns to use a single code combination to represent unique lexical items, unique words like dark, water, greasy, and so on. It also learns new words. One of the cool things that we got from these models is we trained the models on 8 words of English, and they start producing new words of English that they never heard before. And that's great because they are productive, and by very limited, by exposing the models to very limited data, they can extrapolate and learn new and produce new words. For example, the network is trained on ask, dark, water, like, suit, greasy, and carry, and it generates start, although it never heard start before. So they're very, because they're learning by imitation, they need to learn really well internally. Another thing we did is, here is an example of how the network learns suit, and not only learns the representation of word, it learns the articulatory representation of a word, right? It learns to move articulators in an appropriate way such that the output will give a desired single word. An example of suit. Okay, so this is now one interpretability technique. There are more where basically we can show that these networks are learning in a similar ways, like symbolic-like representations, as humans are learning, or as we linguists think that they're meaningful. Now we have another way to look inside the network, and basically we can look really inside them to see how they're creating data and how they're processing spoken language. And this is how a generator looks like in a little bit of zoomed in way. So it has several layers. So the reason deep learning is called deep learning is because each model has several layers. So that's why the deep word comes from. And so we have this interpretability technique that we proposed, where we can introspect how through these layers the model is generating spoken language. Okay, so this is just an example. This is some spoken output, and we can see how as we go deeper in the layer, the representation gets more and more abstract. Okay. Now, the reason this is super useful is we can understand how these models are processing speech and how they're doing that internally, but also we can compare human processing of speech with artificial neural network processing of speech. Okay, so the way that we hear spoken language is complex, but it basically goes through several stages. So first, right, we have the cochlea on the bottom left. And that's where sound, pressure, vibration gets transformed into neural activity. That neural activity travels first through the brain stem onto the cortex, where the final processing happens. Okay. Now, what we have done in this study is we have this artificial baby learner, and not only behaviorally, it learns language in similar stages as humans, it learns similar representations that are meaningful. It also processes speech in a similar way than humans' brain processes speech. So how did we test it? We sent the exact same syllable through through human subjects and through artificial neural networks and compare them. Okay, and so the human subject technique is very interesting. It's called the complex auditory brainstem response, or ABR, and basically this is the syllable that sounds a little bit like ba. You can hear it. And this is how it is reflected in the brainstem. Now, this is a technique where you only have 4 electrodes, and you're recording with such high sampling rate that you're catching your sound as it's traveling through the brainstem. And if you these are 15 speakers of English and Spanish. If we sum them over, this is basically how the sound ba looks like in the brain. So it looks like a ba, and you can also hear it. You can probably hear a little bit of a ba there. So basically, you can listen to how your ba sound sounds inside the brain, in the brainstem. And so what we did was we sent the same syllable ba through human brains and through our artificial baby learner. And it is for the first time that we were able to observe a very, very similar signal when humans and artificial neural networks are processing sounds. And so a lot of work so far that compares human brain and artificial neural networks takes one signal and transform it into another. So they need to find an extra step that tells them, okay, the humans and artificial neural networks are similar. Here it is the first time that we were able to show that these signals are similar in raw form, without any transformations, without any extra steps. And actually, the way we get these similar signals is very similar in both the brain and an artificial neural network. Why? So what does brain imaging do? It gives us a summary of electric activity in time domain, right? As we're listening to sounds. And this is exactly what we have in our interpretability techniques. What we're doing is we're averaging over all feature maps, so all intermediate layers in the deep layers over time domain. And so even the technique that we're getting these, so we're getting biological electric activity on the biological neurons by averaging, and we're getting artificial activity by averaging in the time domain in the artificial neural networks. This is how the same syllable sounds, for example, in the artificial neural network. We also have shown that language experience probably modulates both brain wiring in the brainstem, and also artificial neural network response. So the Spanish trained network and English trained network correspond very similarly to Spanish monolinguals and English monolinguals. So that's promising, and it opens a lot of further research. We're also showing, we've shown that earlier in our brain process, in the brain auditory pathway, earlier processing corresponds to earlier layer in deep neural networks, and later processing, like cortical processing on the outskirts of the brain, corresponds to deeper layer. So this is also nice. For example, I show you that picture that was getting more and more abstract. We see there that at the end, the final layers pretty much only encode acoustic envelope, and this is exactly what is encoded in the cortex very prominently. Okay, now on to non-human intelligence and how we're trying to leverage interpretability technique for non-human intelligence. So this is the work that I've been doing with collaborators, but the idea is the same, right? So the idea is that sperm whales, which is this amazing creature, have some information, they encode it into their vocalization, and then they decode it. And so we're using our artificial baby and artificial neural network and tell it, okay, learn sperm whale communicate, learn to imitate sperm whales, but also learn to embed information. And then we're asking the network, what kind of information did you learn like what did you use, what acoustic properties did you use to embed information? And this is one possible approach to basically make sense of data that we have absolutely no ideas about. And this is extremely powerful tool, not only for sperm whales, but other types of data as well. So sperm whales communicate with these clicks, and they group these clicks into groups of clicks that are called codas. It's a fascinating communication system, but as I mentioned, we have absolutely no idea what they're doing. Okay. what anything means. So what we did, as I mentioned, is we trained the network on sperm whale communication system. This is how a group of clicks called coda, and which is the basic units in their communication system, looks like. And this is part of Project SETI, which is a really awesome interdisciplinary project that aims to understand sperm whales. So what we did is we trained a network that needed to imitate those codas, right? It needed to learn to produce sounds that look like sperm whales codas, sperm whale vocalization, but also embed information, right? So the generator needs to embed information, the decoder needs to decode information, and then we look inside it and ask it, what kind of properties about this communication system did you use in order to learn to embed information, right? So what can be potentially meaningful? So interpretability in AI is not yet at a stage where we can just throw stuff into the model and tell it, give me the result. It's at a stage where we basically shrink the hypothesis space, right? So I have no idea currently what can be meaningful, or at least I want to have no idea. I want to be as unbiased as possible. I have no idea what is meaningful in this communication system. I ask AI to give me basically clues to where to look for, right? And so what we've learned is kind of really encouraging. So the model learns to generate clicks that look like sperm whale clicks, and then we ask it, what have you learned internally with this same technique, right? So the idea is, if the model had learned completely on its own that S is a meaningful property in human speech, where ground truth exists, where we know that S is meaningful, what will it learn in sperm whales? If I can access that, I have a good candidate for what is meaningful in sperm whale communication system. And so we kind of married the causal inference techniques. We borrowed from causal inference, which is a approach in statistics, paired that with our interpretability techniques, and we got some really encouraging results, which is we confirmed what humans thought was meaningful, which is number of clicks in a coda, number of clicks in a unit is important, and timing between this is important. If you remember the way this click sounded that I showed you was click, 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 right? So the timing is important. But we also uncovered something that was not considered meaningful before, which is that spectral mean, so spectral properties, so acoustic properties and acoustic regularity might be meaningful. And that's what we're actively exploring now. So the idea is that we confirmed what people thought it was meaningful, but the AI interpretability gave us clues what to look for, where to look for, because the AI needed to find the most informative things about this communication system that we as humans might have missed. It also learns to, our model also learns rules, internal rules about codas, which is really exciting, and learns to generate new codas, just like it learns to generate new words that it never heard before, but are plausible codas or units in sperm whale communication system. So that's good. So this is what brings us closer to the answering the question, what is meaningful in the sperm whale communication? What rules govern their communication system? This is just a use case of how AI interpretability, so the ability to pair extreme power of these models with our understanding of what internally they had learned, what insights about data they can give us. This is really powerful, and so this is a use case of that. There are other problems that we can use these techniques as well outside of sperm whale communication system. But sperm whale communication system is really nice because We have no ideas what is going on, but it's probably highly meaningful and informative system. So we can compare what kind of, what design features of our language the whales have, how they learn to communicate, how the acquisition works, and what the vocalization mean. Now back to large language models, which is the talk of the day. So I was initially quite critical of LLMs. I mentioned that they're not a very realistic model of human language learning, but they're great for other ways as well. So this is a part where I show you the big picture question, like how we can use even non-realistic models to gain understanding about human and animal intelligence and communication systems. So LLMs are great for telling us what is possible in artificial neural computation. Okay, and so back in the day, models were small and non-proprietary, and we were able to do this kind of introspection that I just showed you, right? I'm training my networks and I'm looking inside them with different techniques. But now models are proprietary, the companies are not allowing everyone to look inside them. And also, the models are so gigantic that it's very difficult to do this kind of introspection interpretability. So we resort to something that we call behavioral interpretability, where we just explicitly use explicit prompts to try to understand what kind of representations the networks have internally. And so one of the things we did a couple of months ago is we said, okay, can we use metalinguistics? So the ability to do language, the ability to reason about language, not only to do language, to understand what is possible in non-human intelligence, right? And so this is, the results we got were quite surprising. And it shows us that this kind of approach can be quite promising. The idea is that can we use linguistic theory or linguistic formalism as a tool to introspect these models? And so we asked the model, the models are doing language pretty well, right? They can write text, they can tell you whether a sentence is wrong or not, and so on. And so we asked the model not to understand this sentence, but to analyze it. Okay, so we have a sentence: the mouse, that the cat, that the dog painted, thought, sang. You probably didn't quite, maybe you have, maybe you haven't, but a lot of people have troubles with understanding and parsing this sentence. LLMs, at least GPT-4, does not have any problems with parsing, but it also parses it in terms of linguistic theory. And it parses, we said, take linguistic formalism, syntactic formalism, and analyze this sentence. And it does remarkably well. I saw an elephant with binoculars. We gave them this sentence, asked him to parse it with syntactic theory. And GPT 3.5, which is a precursor to the 4th version, did not do the task well, but GPT-4 did the task really well. Now, of course, you can say, this sentence is very common in linguistic textbooks. So we, came up with new sentences. I fed my baby turtles. It does well on that as well. By the way, I wanted to do this on vision, on the vision world as well. So there's this called stable diffusion that generates pictures based on what you write. And I wasn't able to get I fed my baby turtles, the other reading, right? So when you have a baby and you're feeding the baby turtles, until I realized, okay, there is a painter, Hieronymus Bosch, who could probably draw something like that. And when I asked the stable diffusion model to give me I fed my baby turtles in the style of Hieronymus Bosch, I got pretty close to that. So prompting is important. But anyway, going back, so even in other languages, the syntactic, this explicit metalinguistic formalism is very useful to understanding how these models are able to parse language and what kind of metalinguistic understanding they have. We also tested this on phonology or semantics, not only syntax, and the models performed there remarkably well as well. So the ultimate goal of this project was to try to understand whether something that scientists think only humans have. I mean, it's not full agreement, but for the most part, there's an agreement between scientists that only humans have recursion. So recursion is this infinity of language, if you want. So the ability to always embed something into a larger constituent of the same type. Can this property of human language emerge in a non-biological, non-human intelligence? And we use the same kind of prompting here as well. And so the results were really remarkable as well, but only in the GPT-4 version. So only in the latest, the most powerful model did we see a really good, consistent performance where the model can recognize recursion, add layers of recursion, and so on. For example, a boy who I saw a girl yelled my name, and it adds layers, right? So this is the 11th example. A boy who I saw a girl that a dog followed, yelled my name, and so on. That it gets really, really long, which is interesting. A boy who I saw a girl that a dog that a cat chased, followed, yelled my name. So this is called center embedding. But you get the point. So the model is able to recognize recursion and also add to recursion, add layers of recursion, add embedding. We also tested it on visual world, right? So can it understand recursive patterns that are not linguistics, and it learns to kind of create these interesting shapes that have recursive structure. So in other words, we were trying to understand whether their non-human communications, non-human animal communication systems have many aspects of human language, but one thing that we haven't really found is recursion. And so we wanted to test whether something as non-human, something as artificial intelligence can have recursion, and not only recursion, but an explicit awareness, or awareness is a tough word, but explicit ability to do recursion. And the answer is yes, but only in the latest models. So the idea is that recursive reasoning with metacognitive awareness first evolved in humans, but it can also, emerge in artificial intelligence trained on human language, and it remains to be seen if animals can do it or have it in the wild. So there are many problems with, there are many dangers with understanding with doing this kind of work, but they're not unsurmountable. And so this is, I think, a promising direction, and very useful from cognitive modeling perspective. As I mentioned, LLMs are not very naturalistic, and they're not a good model of how humans learn, but nonetheless, they can tell us what is possible in a non-human intelligence, right? So now we have, as I mentioned, all three players: humans, animals, and machines, and we're learning from all of them. And we're trying to understand answer the common question of what is language, what is intelligence, how, is there something uniquely human about language or not, and so on. So this is about LLMs. The papers, as I mentioned, all available online. And so to conclude, I think this is good timing to end my talk, but so understanding how machines learn is very important, because we can use that introspection. We can, use their extremely good performance and find causal structure about data that we humans would not have found because we're biased. And it's also important to understand how we're starting to learn differently or similarly from each other. And how, that's also important for regulation, for our, safety, for dispelling the myths that are circulating around these models. And so spoken language especially is really powerful tool to do this kind of work. And to answer this long-standing question, is there something uniquely human about humans, or is just a continuum? And if we interpolate to more intelligence, we can get to human levels. But anyway, studying these three components together is extremely important and very informative for understanding how we're similar and different, what is uniquely human, and also, as I mentioned, to finding patterns in data that we wouldn't have found because we're biased as humans.